I wanted to go ahead and welcome everyone for coming to our virtual art club today. And thank you for coming. And a special thank you to our members and our Visionary Society members who make programming like this possible. This month, we're very pleased to welcome artist Alexander Martin, who will be presenting their own work to you while you enjoy your coffee and treats at home instead of here with us at the museum as normal. A few quick reminders. I'll be keeping everyone muted until the end for questions. We are going to be recording this presentation and it will be posted online following the presentation. If you do not want your video or image recorded, feel free to stop your video so that you can't be seen. So without further ado, we'll invite questions and discussions and allow folks to unmute themselves following the conversation to ask any questions. So without further, I'd like to welcome Alexander Martin for our art club.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. It's good to see you all. So I'm currently giving this talk from my basement studio, which is where I do and prepare for most of my performances. So if you see weird costumes and wigs behind me, that's why. But today I am going to do a little bit of brief introduction. I know some of you, but I'll give you a little bit about me and my history. And then I want the focus of this talk, it's going to be about my work, but I want to talk about things coming together and working together, specifically related to my own practice and how you're going to see there's a lot of slides. You're going to see a lot of work today. I'm going to be covering a pretty broad range of stuff I started in undergrad before I moved to Peoria, coming into the brand new stuff that I haven't even released to the public yet, and some work that's in progress. But I want to use this as an opportunity to talk about my own journey with that practice and how it reflects my own identity and how they all intersect and why I'm working on a more cohesive body of work right now. So to begin, before I start screen sharing and show you the PowerPoint, I am Alexander Martin. I am a queer, Black, non-binary artist, currently living and working in Peoria, Illinois. I grew up in a small town, Hurricane, West Virginia. So I grew up Appalachian. I'm biracial, so I was raised by my mother's white family in the absence of the Black side of my family. I had to put in a lot of identity work early on in my life. So growing up Black in a mostly white area, surrounded by mostly white family, I've had to navigate that identity, like being Black in a white space, but then also being part white in Black spaces. Navigating queerness, my own identity coming out later in college, then coming out again after college. Embracing aspects of my gender identity. All of these different parts of my life and my experience have me intersecting and living at various nexus points. I live in between lots of communities and I drift between them. And so I try to make work that reflects that space that I live in, work that makes my existence make more sense to me, and then hopefully can educate and inform others of that space, that we all exist in these spaces, we all exist in these unique spaces. But I had to put a lot of identity work on early in my life, and that is what led me to make the work I do now. I think that's the reason I chose to be an artist, is it helps me navigate that. Now, some of the early work you're going to see isn't necessarily directly related to that, because again, it was a journey coming to there. But I want to kind of give you an overview of where I'm coming from and who I am art-wise. So yeah, without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started with the PowerPoint. Screen share and share my desktop. Screen sharing is new to me, so if I mess up, I apologize. Okay, so let's get started. So this is just the opening slide, but it's also some images of me and my work from a photo shoot I was working on recently. So we're going to start with the series I sort of came into in undergrad when I was beginning to better understand what my voice is and what I can do with the art. So I studied in printmaking. I got my BFA in printmaking and then my master's in fine art and printmaking as well. So this is from my BFA, which was at West Virginia University. This series was called Assumptions, but I was doing a lot of CMYK process printing at the time, which is doing multiple layers of screen printing to do a photographic image. I was obsessed with objects at the time. I really was drawn to the mundane, the things that were around me, and I liked these sort of forced assumptions that people made. All the text from this series is paired with an object. And so the text is something I associate with the object. But when I was really fascinated with that space where viewers had to make a forced connection, like we want to relate text and object, we want to relate things that are side by side, we want to relate diptychs. And so I was really drawn to that relation and thinking a lot about language. In undergrad, I studied art and art history, but I also got a minor in Japanese, studied linguistics. I really like language and the structures of it and how it sort of shapes how we think. And so I was playing with that with this series. Um, and then I moved to, and also the titles of these are what the text are. So I don't know if you can see them. The tiger playing saxophone says, "Hell yeah, brother." And the little cat statue says, "So 100 yen is the price of a god." Um, so these were just titled based off of the text associated with them. There's "Thanks for the cake" and "Every boy needs a lighter." Um, then in 2014, I graduated undergrad and I moved to Peoria, Illinois. I've been here since. When I was in graduate school, I was still trying to think of that object and text relation. Um, but I also started bringing in containers. I had a brief stint of being really obsessed with bags and packaging, partially because it was surrounding me. It was an easy material to get a hold of. I was really thinking of how to make a more sustainable studio practice, how to reuse materials around me. But then also I like this idea of containment and holding things in. And so I was still pairing them with text, but the text was coming from journaling and writing, documenting things around me, and doing a lot of stuff with these found materials. Still print lots of printmaking processes. These are collagraphs and screen printing mix. I was mixing mediums, playing with texture. Again, I really like layering, texture, and depth. Um, Started doing more collagraphs with more found objects. So these are texts. A lot of these are phrases that were uttered near or around these objects I was using. A lot of them are from either conversations friends said when they gave me these objects because they knew what I was using, or a lot of them, since I was using bags, or conversations I documented from checkout clerks. Started recreating. So this is done with screen printing. I started using uh, the actual material. So instead of just making prints of them, I was like, how can I get more sculptural? How can I get in the space more? Really started thinking about installation and other works like that. And so I started using material. This is done with vinyl that kind of imitates the texture of a plastic bag. Again, playing with text, thinking of word bubbles and word balloons, things of that nature. More collagraphs and screen printing. I was also really drawn in undergrad. I became very meticulous, and I was very drawn to this sort of pristine, uh, very clean look, which I've now, as you'll see, as the work changes, I've sort of changed outside of that. But I was very obsessed with things being clean and perfect and seamless. But then I started experimenting a little bit more, um, playing with other materials, playing with surface and space. Um, the piece on the right, the "Don't Say That," actually has stuff on the back. So this is just documentation of it. But when it's installed in the space, there was a mirror displayed with it, so you could read the text reflected, and then the text reflected red in the golden piece beside of it. Again, I really like diptychs. It's pairing those two objects together and forcing a connection, and I like the conversation that these things had in space. But the beginning of this work was when I really started to develop on my own. Like when I first came to Peoria, I came out to a few people as being bi or gay at the time. And was navigating my own identity then, but I knew that wasn't the whole story. I just didn't have the words or the language for it. And so I started placing more of myself in my work. I think I was afraid to do that. I was afraid of including personal connections or things of that. I thought my work needed to be not just clean visually, but also content wise clean, very analytical. It was kind of like a stain of academia in my mindset. But then I started looking at the artists I love and admire, and how much of their own, how all artists, how much of their own life and stories um, get poured into their work. And so these pieces you see right here were the beginning of that starting to play. The wooden vinyl with the "shall we" cut into it was a reference to the dance floor. I dance a lot, I perform. This was before I started performing, but bringing in aspects of my own life, and also realizing that all this work I'd been making up to this point, not to say that it was passive aggressive, but I was venting things that I thought about myself or about my place with other people in this work unintentionally. We all put our own, if you're making work, you put yourself into it. And so I was unintentionally bringing in these things that I wasn't even processing until I made them into a physical piece. And then this piece right here, is that address, was the beginning of understanding my identity more, but then also putting myself in my work more and more. So again, a container, this was like a dressing drawer thing to hold your tie, your suit, jacket, and then like your cufflinks and things of that nature. I keep forgetting you all can't see me. I'm pantomiming with my hands, but you only see the presentation. um, and so this was actually based off of a conversation where I was wearing an outfit and someone questioned me like, oh, is that a dress? But they asked with a tone in their voice that I did not um, appreciate. And I was like, why would it matter if it was? It's clothing. I can wear what I want. You shouldn't assume anything about me. And so, again, in sort of silently expressing things that were bothering me, I put it in my work. So, this is a blazer that I wear. And then these ties are hanging saying, is that a dress? Again, using a lot of text, still really obsessed with language. Um, and then inside the drawer, when you open it up, there's a small piece of paper representing my internal voice saying, is that a problem? Because these are the things I wasn't vocal about. Those of you who may have seen me or have known me since I moved here have maybe seen a change in how I present myself and how vocal I am about my identity and things. Well, this was the beginning of that. I had found a place where I could explore and be myself. And now this work was the beginning of putting that out there and like trying to break down that fear of being personal. And then again, playing with starting to understand and explore gender identity more. I started putting it in my work, still working with containers, still very connected to the use of bags and bag imagery. These were a series of photos playing with materials, starting to put people in space and see what I can do there. They also led to a series of drawings that aren't in this slide, but they were really fun. Like, again, I started to bring in more fun, starting to play more in the studio, and enjoyed that a lot more. And then this was the series of work that came after exploring materials, doing the photo series. Um, Instead of just printing and referencing these packages and containment, I started using these actual materials in the work, again, because they were around me. But I was thinking about why I was so obsessed with containers up to this point, and I believe it was this idea of fragility and containment, like fragile masculinity, um, fragility of identity, and like the things we hold in, like with the "is that a dress" piece, um, that internal voice. And so I was trying to think more material wise, how can I reference that, just like outside of text and still using actual packaging materials. The piece on the left was my left was on a freight lid. So it was a huge container. And then bubble wrap. Bubble wrap was used to create the textures on there. I was like sort of printing, sort of painting with bubble wrap. And the piece on the side, canvased, broken down, and then fixed with painted bubble wrap that was actually used to make the piece on the other side. And then I was a member of the Backspace Art Collective, and we did a piece, an exhibition where we each made work that sort of fit together like a puzzle. And I was wondering how I could use this packaging material and still reference these things I was working with. And so I started doing sculpture. Like, again, I'm trained as a printmaker. I've always been interested in and have done a lot of mixed media work. But I'm trained as a printmaker. So I was thinking of how to take these techniques and make them more dimensional, take up more space. And so this was the beginning. This exhibition was the genesis of my Boys Will Be Boys series, which I'm going to show you now. Um, so these were all dealing with, all of these were cardboard sculptures, again, dealing with that idea of fragility, dealing with that idea of containment. A lot of them are referencing the body or cocoons, things like that, kind of viscera. Um, A lot of the insides were pink and glamorous, like parts of myself that I was hiding at the time were starting to show more, were inside, and the outside was usually the muted um, texture and color of the cardboard, playing with geometry, like the different ways you can approach things. I really like the different angles, like with this piece, when you're approaching from one side, you can't see it, but then when you turn your head, you see the other side. So looking at themes from multiple angles, what that means conceptually. And then getting messier, trying to loosen up that sort of rigidity I had boxed myself into, not only loosening up as a person with my own identity, but loosening up in practice, like what I'm actually making. This is also when I went into a big stint with glitter, which is a painful material to work with. Um, this piece was called Masculinity, and it was sort of the when things started to click for me with this series. But it was talking about fragile masculinity and the way we have to perform things. Like, I am not the most masculine person, but I still hid or abused parts of my femininity, um, and try to build the structure around it to be acceptable, to be presented a certain way. And this work captures that. This is the sort of fragile structure of performative masculinity in the culture we're in. And this doesn't just apply to masculinity, it can apply to any kind of fragile surface performance we put on to protect what we are inside. But with this piece, it's a wall piece, I was thinking of these contents start to fill out, the structure starts to come apart, and we keep patching it up. There's nails in it, there's pink nails holding it together, there's glamour and glitz oozing out of it. It's like we try to keep patching these things, but eventually they come through. They come through on the surface. If you learn to heal that part of yourself and then show it with pride, it can become powerful. But if you hide it up and keep trying to build up these structures, it can break. And that's what leads to a lot of backlash or violent behavior, hate. A lot of things are generated from this, from the fragility of these structures we can find ourselves in. Here's some detailed shots of the pieces. This was actually from my MFA show. So I, in 2017, got my master's in fine art from Bradley University. Um, and the exhibition was titled Boys Will Be Boys, but it was about all these things I've been dealing with, thinking of masculinity, thinking of my own journey. The beginnings of these pieces, or not the beginnings of these pieces, but for the exhibition, some of these pieces, the outside started showing more and more color. It wasn't just, it was still built with cardboard, bubble wrap, and packaging materials, but they started showing more color on the surface. And I did as well. My identity was starting to come to fruition. I was starting to understand my more. I was nurturing all aspects of my identity, and I started to present myself more, uh, not just more femininely, but more honestly. And then my work started doing the same. So the surfaces of these, instead of being the sort of muted, I mean, they're still muted colors, but instead of being the muted palette of cardboard and packaging material, they started bringing in more of these hues that I was bringing into my own life. This was actually a reference to 70s and 80s. There's groups of feminist artists making womb rooms. So this was a safe space. So when you call in, there's bubble wrap on the floor. That's what the pink is. And you can crawl inside, and there's room for one person, two, if you get really comfortable. um, but you could sit inside, and it's very quiet and muffled. Sound gets distorted because it's cardboard and layered tablecloth and plastic wrap inside. So like sound gets distorted, and you're safe in there. Then if someone's approaching, you can hear them approaching on the bubble wrap. You can feel them coming. You can hear the pops, and you know that someone's approaching, so you can like let the next person in. But also, there's a reference to a safe space. That part of ourselves that we hide away but try to nurture slowly. I wanted it to reference like a zen, like a rock garden. So that's why I have these little sculptures, and the big ones are sort of rock shaped. Also, a lot of the sculptures were organic at the time anyway, but I wanted to sort of reference like a rock garden, or a place where you can go for like quiet meditation, but a place where you're safe and protected from the world around you. This was another sculpture from that series, referencing a heart. I also, in understanding and learning more about my gender identity, started to learn more about what it means to be Black in America. Like, I have my own lived experiences, but growing up in a predominantly white area, I didn't necessarily have the community to share that with. And so things, when I moved to Peoria, I started feeling more connected to members of my Black community, feeling more connected to those around me, meeting other queer Black individuals, um, and realizing that these weird instances I had growing up, these moments of discomfort, they weren't just unique to me. It's something that all of my people face every day, um, constantly, and all these microaggressions add up. And so I had to get it out in my work. But then through getting out of my work, I met other people and learned that like I wasn't alone in these experiences. So this piece is titled "So Are You the Weekend?" And it's based off of like I wear my hair as a person of color. Like hair is very important to me. It's very important to our community. There's all kinds of ways we wear it and style it, and it symbolizes so many things. And so if I have my hair in twists or in braids, I would go out to like a bar or something, or go out to a public event, and people would always ask me, predominantly white folk would walk up and be like, "Oh, are you the Weekend?" Like the singer or the performer, just because of my hair. I look nothing like this man, but people lump together people of color as one group. And so I had slightly similar hair. And they were like, "Oh, you must be the Weekend," which would be the equivalent of me walking up to anybody with like layered hair and saying, "Oh, are you Jennifer Aniston?" Like, it doesn't work that way, but it would happen all the time. Or people asking to touch my hair, people asking to do these things like it was a trophy, like it was something they could own. And so this piece, titled "Are You the Weekend?" based off those interactions, I was referencing shrunken heads, like trophies of war. And so this was kind of a reference to that. And then thinking of like how people try to use our hair as a way to take dominion over us. Like, "Oh, I have the right to touch it. I have the right to question you about it. I have the right to know if it's real or if it's weave or if it's this," like almost like headhunters. This is again more work dealing with fragility. This piece is entitled "Bust." I showed this again at an exhibition in Florida, and I had reapproached it and added more color and texture to it. And this was the other series of work I was working at the time. Again, at this time frame, I was working in series consistently. Uh, I don't know if it was just the way my mindset was, or like if I had an idea, I had to categorize it. And so I was doing the Boys Will Be Boys series, but also working on this, which is the daily aesthetics. And so every day I documented my clothing and the outfits I was wearing. So I would post them on social media, usually via Snapchat. Now I sometimes use Instagram for this because I haven't been making them daily anymore, but I still do this occasionally. But I would post them with a name that not only captured like what it was I was wearing, but like the theme I was feeling, to try to talk about how I explore my own identity. It's like, it's not just a binary. It's not just boy and girl. It's a lot more than that. You pull from a lot more sources. And so I would name these aesthetics that sort of encapsulated how I was feeling and how my clothing was made to show that to someone else. Like I dress myself a certain way to express how I'm feeling. The photo with me in it is a large, it's the first time I made a large scale one using fabric and found objects, but there's 100 of them. And so they all have really wild names. If you go through my website, you can actually see them all individually scanned, but there was 100 days in a row where I wore different outfits and documented them every day. And the names like there'd be like business casual witch boy, or drumsticks covered in a trash bag, like just really weird, funny names to sort of capture like the shapes I was making, the way I was feeling that day. Um, and so this also acted as a documentation of like me embracing different parts of my identity and no longer feeling fear and expressing those. And I was obsessed with how like if we lived in a nudist society, um, that it's harder to like clothing expresses certain things. Like if we live in a nudist society, we may not know as much about someone uh, based off of what they aren't wearing, and because clothing is a way like for us to feel, to express who we are a little bit. It doesn't express everything. Like who we are is an internal thing, and clothing has nothing to do with that. But it lets others see that. It's like an unspoken language. If you talk to a lot of queer individuals, like the first time we wear something more feminine, the first time you put on that dress, you're scared, but you feel really good. It feels right on you. And so this was sort of capturing that moment, or those moments. Um, Immediately after that, it's kind of a jarring jump, sorry, but immediately after grad school, I was honored and privileged enough to get to go on a residency program in Tottenham Hale in London in the UK. So this was the view from my studio. It was in an old church. that actually was still had services. So on Sunday, if you were making in the studio, you could hear the choir singing. It was really beautiful. But I wanted to use this as an opportunity to try to work around being an artist and understanding being in the arts world outside of academia, to sort of separate myself from that space and see what it is to make without the pressure of like school and performance, like what it is to be an artist. And so the space I was in had artists living and working their day-to-day life, most of them out of school. And so I got to be in that space with them. And I went over there specifically to research gender and the ideas behind gender, sexuality, and race in the UK, because culture is reflected on, language is a reflection of culture, sorry. And the words we use shape sort of how we think. So like in undergrad, I went to Japan. They have very different ideas about race and gender, but their language is very different than ours too. I was really curious as to another English speaking country, how they viewed gender identity and sexuality, but then also ideas about race, because their history, um, like Black identity in the US is formed from diaspora, and that separation, like slavery led to that separation, and we formed our own identity here from separation. But people in the UK, although there's still issues of race there, they have more of a connection to where their families came from. They know they have more of a cultural connection to that. And so I wanted to explore that more. This is me at a beach with fish and chips, just to give it a location so you know I'm in the UK. But I got to do a lot of awesome things while I was over there. This is my friend Sophie with these queer British art catalogs. It was like the stars aligned. There was a bunch of exhibitions at the Tate about queer artists. There was also, on the left, you see the person with the elephant trunk. There was a film being made about Black diaspora. And so I got to meet a lot of Black creatives who were living and working in the UK, and talk to them about the film they were working on. And I also got to answer some of my questions about that. So like we were in a circle introducing ourselves and talking about where our families are from. And so most of them, aside from a couple, were English. And so, but they would say, oh, I'm from this town, my family's Ghanaian, or my family's Nigerian, or my family's Ethiopian, because they still have that connection. When it came to me, it was like, I'm Alex, I'm American, and that's all they needed. Like they know that if I'm from America, I most likely don't have that connection to my ancestry. And so my identity is shaped by the country I'm from. And so it led to a lot of really interesting conversations about race and identity. I also got to meet with some artists I really like. This is Oliver Doe. They were a queer artist working in Newcastle. And I actually got to, through the help of Bradley Galleries, bring their work with an exhibition I curated with Aaron Buzinski, bring Oliver's work to the US, which I was really excited to make that connection and bring the work that I fell in love with over there, bring it back over here. During my time there, I took loads of photos. This is me going to, there was a gay pub that was doing a drag night, but it was a drag night for people of Indian descent. So people referencing Bollywood and lots of other culture that I haven't got to see, and like talking about queer identities in that. And this was actually one of the performers getting her nails done on stage. They were doing nails and henna tattoos. And so I took lots of photos while I was over there. I didn't want to make a lot of big work to bring back, so I mostly did small scale stuff, but took lots of photos of things I saw. So I noticed lots of flowers, lots of brick, because it was springtime in a city, lots of old buildings. And so there's just these pops of color with these sort of strict, rigid structures that they were fit into. And so I brought that thinking about my work and thinking about masculinity and identity, started thinking those parallels of like packaging materials and softness, but now referencing flowers and the environment around me, the built environment of London. So that's where some of this work came from. These are smaller scale pieces that I made in the studio at the beginning, just trying to do some studies and figure out materials that I could make and bring back to the US. These were images, again, flowers and bricks. They were everywhere. And I started making work referencing that. Fences, even like painted on trash cans, there's a fly trap that looked like flowers. So I just started seeing this image everywhere and thinking about softness and fragility and beauty. And so I started making these more sculptural works. These were all done in the studio space, kind of playing with the materials that I had around me. And then using these as references for when I came back to the US. This was actually a collaborative work. So looking at the cardboard sculptures I'd been making before, I worked with an artist there. who had been doing work with horseshoe crabs that she had gold leafed. And so we got to collaborate on a piece, which was super fun. I mean, these are just more of the photos. Again, flowers, pinks, brick, buildings, neon. Lots of these things just kept popping up. And so the series that came from, I'm going to open my website for this part. The series that came to that from that was Garden View. So a lot of the series is actually on display at, or not on display, was on display at the Contemporary Arts Center. But this is sort of a culmination of the work I had done over there. And also personally, it was referencing a point where I've always been interested in found materials and these sculptural objects and using them. But this is when I started to feel more connected to the materials I was using and actually gathering materials specifically for these things I was referencing from my time abroad, rather than happening upon materials and stockpiling them, which is my normal habit. But this was the work from that series. Lots of found objects, again, flowers and fencing. I was kind of just playing, like I learned that like the stereotypes and stigmas facing LGBTQ plus people over there are still the same as they are over here. It's just slightly different. So this series I consider similar to Boys Will Be Boys, but using different materials. So trying to sort of tell the same story, but with different materials to reference my time over there and looking at it through a different lens. And then after this series is when I started thinking of what is my, like, what form is my work going to take? Like, it was easy to sort of focus in on processing the things I had learned from the residency, but now I was wondering, how am I going to, like, where am I going now as an artist? I am outside of school. I have to find a job. I'm living and working in Peoria. What do I do? If you remember some of those photos, some of these are in direct reference to some of those photos I took, sort of deconstructions of that. And so in my head, I was still wrapped up in this idea of working in series. And so right after I got back from the residency, after grad school, I was sort of working in a few separate series. I was doing some works on paper and collaborative pieces and other things, but I was working on Pocket Play and Queer Craft. So Pocket Play is a series referencing the gay hanky code. So again, looking at queer history, and it was at a time when you couldn't be vocal or out, like you would get arrested. It was illegal to be LGBTQ plus. People would wear different handkerchiefs in their back pocket to symbolize different things they're into, different things they're looking for, different fetishes. Like if you have keys in one back pocket, it means you're hosting at your house. If you have keys in like your right pocket, it means you're looking for a place. So again, it's language. So going back to my love of language, but it was a time to just be like incognito and try to speak to each other. It's the language of some of my queer ancestors. And so this is actually from a collaboration with Heather Braumeyer. But I started doing these things to reference that and looking at queer history. And then I was also looking at like queer culture and like kink culture and things of that. But I was also looking at, anybody who knows me, I'm obsessed with the occult. I love the history of witchcraft and pagan practices, the persecution of women and the persecution of witches throughout history, especially in Europe. In the US, we know the Salem witch trials, but in Europe, thousands of people were killed. Men, women, everybody burned at the stake for witchcraft. And also throughout history, LGBTQ plus people have been punished, burned at the stake, executed for their identity. And so I was really started in researching that parallel. And so I started making these pieces. I'm going to skip, we'll go back to the top. I started making these pieces, which were referencing materials and shapes associated with pagan history, but then bringing in remnants of my studio practice, parts of my, the things around me, but making these sort of magic artifacts. But I wanted to, like, it started with this because I was drawn to the aesthetic, but then in doing this, I realized like I have found a connection to like spirituality that I've had my whole life, but was sort of put on the back burner because I grew up Southern Baptist, and being young, biracial, and queer in a Southern Baptist church in Hurricane, West Virginia was not the most affirming experience. And so I sort of separated myself from that. But in doing this, I realized the power of like group meditation, ritual, connection, like in our day-to-day life, even if you have a day-to-day ritual, like waking up and making coffee, every day, that brings you joy, that brings you peace. And so I started thinking of how I can do that with this work and bring in that connection to other people, because all of these were just utilizing materials that are associated with pagan practices. um, but how can I actually bring this practice into a more contemporary space? And so I started making queercraft more about performances and doing remnants. So this image right here is from For Protection Infection, which I invited members of the community during times of political duress, things when we don't know how safe our communities are going to be, how they're going to be affected. It can feel helpless, but this was a chance to write on small pieces of paper um, notes of love and affection for members of your community that you are worried about, people that you care about, your family, your loved ones. And then they would wrap them, dip them in wax that I had made with various herbs associated with love and protection, and then dip them in glitter and tie them to this sculpture, which was a reference to like Japanese wishing trees, where you would tie wishes to a tree to hope for that in the coming year. But this was a collection of people's love and affection, and it was a really peaceful, powerful experience, and it was amazing feeling that connected to my community. And so that began uh, focusing bringing the focus of queercraft to um, bringing the focus of queercraft to performance and installation, and documenting it afterwards. If you come to my website, there's a video link here that you can watch of a performance from the series. But I started doing group rituals and performances where we could all get together, concentrate on a goal, and like feel connected, and then make art objects that we can take home from it. That being this right here. And it started making me connect the worlds of performance and community into my practice more. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so you can see my face. um, but I was still at this time like thinking about where I wanted to go with my work. I know doing these community-based things and these performances felt really good. And I knew I liked performing because I also during this time frame has been starting to discover that I like performing in drag. Drag was letting me, which I have something I'll show you in a second for that, but it let me start using gender and playing with gender, and it felt good. And so I wanted to bring these worlds together. I was trying to break free of that. I think it was still like a scar from academia, but like always trying to work in series and not letting things come more naturally, and not letting my work be more connected overall instead of always separating it and grouping it. I had to classify everything. And so now I am I'm working on making a unified body of work that brings in all of these parts, all of these different things you've seen, all of this stuff you've seen that's talking about my identity and my growth as a person. I am that one being now. And so now I want my work to reflect that. Like I still, like with the Queercraft series, I'll still be doing those as performances. They're their own thing just because it involves everybody. But my own body of work, I wanted to make a more unifying experience for that. And so I'm going to show you some photos real quick of my drag persona I've made. And then I'm going to show you new work, some of which nobody has seen yet, but that's bringing all these worlds together. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. And open up. So Artemisia Van Ho is my drag persona. She represents and embodies all aspects of myself that have been criticized or ridiculed. She is my femininity personified. Through her, I was able to navigate my own identity and gender journey. It was actually through drag and performing in drag that I started to learn more about myself and my identity, and making the costumes, making the wigs, doing the makeup. I was bringing in all these parts, these things I have learned in art school, all these things I learned from being an artist, beginning to show them in a really accessible manner. My third or second year of drag, I actually competed in a pageant and went on to win Miss Gay Illinois, US of A 2019. But during that time, I was going in and out of drag a lot and performing a lot. And I actually started questioning my own identity. I was like, am I a trans woman? This feels right. This feels good. Is this who I am? But I think it just turned out that I was embracing my femininity, embracing these things that I had not been nurturing, and drag was like not only nurturing them but letting them thrive. And so drag helped me find my identity as a non-binary person. Like, I don't have to be a boy or a girl. I'm Alex, uh, and I can express that. And whether it comes through my art or comes through my performances, um, there's it can come through in any kind of way. Like when I'm performing on stage, yes, it's a different time, but that's still me. That's still me, just existing differently at a different point in time. Um, and that's when I actually ended up bringing it and do it to my website. I've talked to my friend Jessica Bingham about our websites being sort of where our headspace is at as artists. And so um, I brought drag onto my website because for me, I'm like, okay, it is a part of my art practice. It is who I am. And then that brings me to the work I'm doing right now, which currently it says in progress because I'm trying to think outside of series. And so I don't know, I don't know what these are going to be yet, but instead of limiting myself by categorizing them, I am letting them come naturally. And so these are referencing like materials and things that I've used from drag, and the remnants of those performances. They are um, things from like pop culture things I'm obsessed with, things about my own identity that I've been wondering about, things I collect. It's bringing all of these together into one um, unified body of work that is me as an artist as opposed to just a series. So now I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and show you this is brand new work from the series. That stuff you saw was from earlier this year. This is work that is still in progress right now. But in doing this work and making work that's more unified, I realized that like I am indirectly working in the realm of self-portraits. Like I don't consider them all to be uh, exact portraits of who I am or what I'm doing, but they're just referencing parts of my identity, parts of my body, parts of my experiences or my community's experiences, um, that I had actually during the beginning of the shelter in place when we all had so much time to just sit and think and be with our own thoughts. I was reading a book. It was a young adult novel, but the main character was trans, and it turns out they were a demi boy, which is an identity that fits under the gender nonconforming umbrella. Um, but they were talking. They were a painter, and then they could not find their voice, but then they started making self portraits. And it was a book made for teens, but it was so amazing reading a queer inclusive story that like the story I never had growing up. And talking about a lot of the characters talking about themselves and referencing themselves in their work, it made me fully embrace that, that I am referencing myself in my work. I went from undergrad like trying to separate that as much as possible, making more colder work, to now just embracing all parts of myself, so, and all the things I like. So this new work, again, these are all in progress shots, so you all are getting the sneak peek. Aside from my studio mate, Barbara Perry, who has seen these because we are in a studio together, you all are getting a sneak peek. Um, but bringing in all these things, like the piece here on the yellow piece has jewels left over from a costume, nails, has a leather pocket. So looking at like the things from queer history, the things from my own identity, the things from my own performances. The one on the right is found materials, but then also sort of looking at the way I was deconstructing stuff and the daily aesthetics. I realized in making that series, I was having so much fun because I was putting myself in it and like celebrating my identity. I feel like as a queer person of color, that already puts me in a group that's not necessarily celebrated, but then also adding my body, like I'm a large bodied person. And I was like, I need to put my body, I need to put my shape, my form, my identity, who I am, into these works, into these spaces, because I have learned to celebrate myself. And I want to do that through my work, let other people become celebrated. Um, and so I started putting that in these works that are still currently in progress. Um, some of them I'm getting ready for a couple of exhibitions coming up. One, I'm shipping work down to Texas, and one I'm shipping work down to Florida. I'm actually, before I open it up to questions, I want to show you all this last piece. So this is the beginning of I'm in a show in Florida called Plays Well with Others, and it's about play and childhood. So this piece is entitled Make Up with an exclamation point. Um, and it's pulling all these things together. So the title is a reference to shows I used to watch growing up with these characters that are magical girls. And so I was obsessed with them as a kid. They would say a phrase that usually ended in makeup and then transform into these glamorous superheroes. And I was fixated on that glamorous transformation, that like powerful femininity. But it was also one of those things I sort of hid because culture at the time, like I was navigating my own identity, but I felt like someone would find me out if I talked about this show I like. And so this piece is letting me connect to my childhood self and play with that. So it's sort of like an abstraction of myself. But when I send this sculpture to the exhibition, there's going to be a video of me playing with it as a toy. And you all are the first to see this. I'm very excited to share it. But it's going to be me playing as a toy, but I'm making costumes for it. And so there's going to be little clothing bins that people can come up. Well, the gallery is going to have one person at a time because the current situation of the whole world. But they'll be able to come and like dress it up any way they want, accessorize it, play with it the way they want, and maybe find like joy in playing with performance and expression in the way that I do now in my adult life. And so let me stop sharing again. And so I just like, that's for me as a culmination of everything. The work I'm working on right now is a culmination of all these things I've been pulling out over these years. Like for the first time, not only do I feel confident in myself as a person, but really, really confident and connected to my work. And realizing that, like, yes, as artists, we like to show our work, we like our work to be seen, but also this work serves a purpose for me. This helps me to embrace parts of myself and love myself, but also express things that I don't have the words or the language for. Art is a new language. It's magic when we make something and people can feel something from it without even knowing what it is. And so the work I'm doing right now, I am trying to embody that completely. And maybe it'll end up being a series, maybe I'll end up working in series again, but right now I'm just letting what I want to do drive what I'm making. And the only time I'm performing, instead of being performative in my practice, the only time I'm performing is if it's that performance is part of a piece or part of the experience I want to share with people. Yeah, do you all have any questions for me? Sorry, that was kind of rapid fire. I knew I was going to have to cover a lot of work in this, but if y'all have any questions, I'm totally down to answer.
Can I
Or
ask
if
a
there's,
question?
yeah.
So thank you so much for this talk. It was really, great to hear you talk about all these different series, and I don't know, it was just amazing, beautiful talk. But I'm just curious, since language has played such a role in how you think about your work, and your sort of linguistic play in your early prints, and the way that sort of carried through in titling, just how that plays a role in your ideation process. Because you showed a lot of images of, you take these sort of photographs that, are just sort of situational photographs, and those are a big source of inspiration. But, sorry, there's some noise in my house. But is like journaling or creative writing, or how does writing sort of factor into your ideation process and how you think about your work, and does that inform your work as like another aspect of your practice? Does that make sense?
Yes. So I don't really formally journal. I have lots of friends who do, and if they saw my journaling process, they would be very mad at me. But I always keep a sketchbook, my planner, and usually a small notebook with me. And I just write down like lots of my thoughts about things, like responses to things. I thrive in kind of a weird chaotic nexus point with like I get pulled in a lot of different directions, so I sort of gather these thoughts from these different places and write them down. But then also writing in like more like formal applications. I've written for a few papers, I've written a few articles and things, and even though those are a little bit more rigid in like their structure, it's letting me channel my thoughts into something more cohesive, and then that goes to affect my work. I also kind of consider my process, like my maintaining my sketchbook and my even parts of my studio practice, as a form of journaling. Like the language has sort of evolved now where it's not included directly in the piece, but it's kind of become the language. Like I make work because I can't say certain things, I don't know how to, and so my work has sort of become a journal. Like it's like a snippet of time. In my sketchbook, which I don't always share with the public, but my sketchbook acts as that space too. It's a lot of like drawing and then loose notes, and documenting thoughts, especially moments where I have to sit with a feeling that I can't quite navigate. I write down exactly what I'm feeling. I use a lot of metaphors, but I write down what I'm feeling, and then I reference that later. And so writing is almost like I collect a lot of materials and bring them together to make my work. Writing sort of works that way too, where it's not formal organized writing. It's a lot of separate bits but I can pull from later and sort of piece together, like start to see the connections between those different points of time and what I was thinking or feeling. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Alex, I have a question for you.
Yes.
All right, so you have a BFA and an
Mhm.
MFA in printmaking,
Yes.
and I see quite a bit of performance, just still that reference to language, but where is printmaking showing up in your current practice?
I think printmaking has left a mark on me in a way that I am finding out more and more every day. um, Printmaking in undergrad was the first time I felt really like, I always felt like, oh, I like art. But printmaking was the first time I felt connected to a practice. Um, and even though I don't make a lot of prints, at least not as much as I used to, the way we approach printmaking, process-driven things, um, has affected me. Like I love process. Um, I think the way I think about color is in layers. Um, and even something like drawing or painting, the way that I learned, like I learned about color through printmaking. I learned about um, like learn to draw, not just like drawing from life, but drawing like what I wanted to make through printmaking. And so I think that's affected how I make my work. Like you can even see, even in the dimensional work, there's lots of layers and texture. If you look at some of the early collagraphs and then look at the work now, like even though it's different, there's still some textural similarities. And so I think my approach to making has been informed by printmaking. Um, in a way that is going to always show up, because I was learning the things I was learning about art and my practice. The crucial things I was learning, a lot of that was while studying printmaking. And so it's through that lens. So again, even though this work is um, not quite a traditional print, um, the way I think about layers, the way I think about color, texture, my approach to things, I think is from the mind of a printmaker.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hear me? Barb Hoffman. Hi, Alex.
Hey.
I don't know why I can't see my picture, but that's okay. But anyway, I really was struck by the term you used called microaggression.
Mm.
And this time that we're talking about, that's it's such an awakening, I think, for many, many people in this country about how we've treated people, how we've talked to people, maybe without even realizing that we were offending someone or being aggressive towards someone in the way we're thinking about it. And in your early work, it looked like you had explored some of those areas. Do you see yourself participating in this almost a renaissance of thinking about enslaved people and the whole issue of how we're going to make that right?
Yes. So, especially in college, when I started to connect more and meet more people of color and learning that I shared experiences with them, it became part of a passion. So even though it wasn't always showing up in my work, like I've been going to Black Lives Matter protests since 2013 when the organization was founded, or not organization, but the movement was sort of founded. And then even before then, I was trying to find ways to advocate for my community. But in learning more about myself and my community, I also learned more about the experiences that I had, that growing up, like even though my family loved me, growing up with a white family, they would show me the blatant face of racism. So I would see like we all know what that looks like when you see someone, you're like, oh, that's clearly racist. But a lot of my experiences growing up, a lot of my experiences to this day are a lot more subtle than that. And it wasn't until I connected with other people of color, other members of my community, that I understood that, oh, my response to these things, my discomfort in these situations is because it's not good. But I didn't even know
Yeah.
it was not good. Um, and so I think that early work, some of the, especially at the text, like the more passive, what I consider passive aggressive work, I think was understanding how many microaggressions I have faced and people around me have faced, and like getting that out. Like I was like, I'm really angry about this. I don't know why, but I'm going to make work about it. well, now in hindsight, I know why I'm mad about it. And now, in light of protests gaining momentum and the Black Lives Matter movement gaining momentum, a lot of other people can start to see that too, because hurt and trauma manifests itself in so many ways, like so many subtle ways that we can't even pick up on. And so art helped me navigate that. And now I can talk to those experiences because of the work I made. And even though like some of my work may not be, I mean, all of my work is going to be political because my identity is politicized. As a non-binary Black person, my existence is up for debate in some people's minds. And so my work is always going to be read as political, even though right now it's more of like a celebration or an embracing of my identity. It's going to be read as political. And I think it helps me explore those aggressions more. Like there's still sometimes hurt and anger, but I feel like the work right now is a little bit more of an experience share and a celebration of who I am. But that can lead to these conversations about these aggressions that my community faces.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we got a question in the chat that says, you mentioned the scar of academia. How can those of us in academia help students find their voice sooner? When I say the scar of academia, academia is an institution, and most of our institutions in the modern world are racist. It's a systematic problem. And those of us in academia don't always even know that. And so like, I didn't realize how much like this idea of professionalism and this idea of how we present our work and how we show and what it is to be an artist, academia kind of leaves a scar on folks where they're like, I have to perform this way, I have to be this way. And as a person of color, it's almost like I have to be in the space of navigating, am I making work about my identity because it's what people want or because it's what I need, even though it's what I want to make? If I were a white boy from the South, I could still be making identity work, but those questions wouldn't come into play. And so I think people who are working in academia, I think you need to perpetually acknowledge the things like the scar that it left on you, but then also acknowledge that to your students. Like when I was teaching a lecture on American art history, I would sound half crazy sometimes talking in circles because I'm like, this is what happened. But we think this is what happened because of the systems in place that have educated us that way. And in doing that, we're ignoring so many other stories. Like you have to backtrack and you have to be comfortable with making mistakes. Another scar of academia is professionalism, perfectionism. I am trying not to use the word professional in my vocabulary ever again because it's an idea that like you have to be a certain way and express a certain way and be perfect for things to have an impact, for work to make sense, whatever. And that's damaging. And like people are afraid to acknowledge their mistakes. Like you see people having backlash when they're called out for issues regarding race. But it's because they aren't in a space to acknowledge that they made a mistake. They don't think they made a mistake because they followed the formula. They followed the academic formula that we're all given of what being professional is and what presenting, what education is. And so I think to help students find their voice sooner, you need to embrace what journeys they go on and acknowledge the flaws of the system we're all working with. Like, you can't just tear it down in a day and rebuild it. You have to work in it, deconstruct it, make it better until we can truly have change. And so I think in sharing sharing that honesty with your students and like saying your own biases. Like I would always acknowledge, like I learned this in school, but school's a problem sometimes. Acknowledging that with your students, I think it helps them to feel safe in exploring that and make it survive the system without as much damage, and then work on deconstructing it.
All right, do we have any other questions? Anything anyone else would like to say? You can either say it, unmute yourself by holding down the space bar, or you can chat in the group chat.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Alex. It's Jackie.
Hey. Hi, Jackie.
Beautiful. I loved hearing you walk us through your history and your work. And you talked about the piece that will be like a playful piece. And I'm really excited to see where that goes and what you are opening yourself up to. And I love that in this time of turmoil, you are in a phase of celebrating who you are. And I'm curious what you are most looking forward to as you look towards the future of your work.
Well, thank you. I think I'm looking forward to mostly like continuing that celebration, but then just being honest in what I'm making and what I'm doing, and letting myself have fun in doing it. Like, again, that scar of academia gives me this rigid idea of like what it is to be an artist, but I'm just excited to explore that space. And like, my work again is always going to be viewed as political, but in a time of turmoil, we see the damage my communities face all the time, and that always gets shared. But we never, especially during times like this, we never share the good things. Like, now I'm finally starting to see people sharing like, oh, this Black-owned business is doing really successful, or this LGBTQ plus organization made a huge impact in this community. People are sharing that more now. But I think as a person of color, I want to organize and advocate, but I also am going to celebrate myself because people need to see that celebration. Now, it's not a distraction from the things that are going on. It's just acknowledging that like, we're still thriving, our community is still thriving for the face of so much turmoil and systematic problems and a struggle. We can still glow, shine, and survive. And so I think in my work, I'm excited to keep on celebrating and keep on being more honest and expressing who I am. If I would have talked to me from like 6 years ago about this artist talk, I would have been like, shut up about your life. What artists are you looking at? What textbooks are you reading? What theory are you looking at? What's making this work so good? What's their historical references? But instead, I shared my work with you all and then talked about who I am, because that's what I want to share, and I feel comfortable in doing that. And so I'm looking forward to keep on doing that.
Yay.
All right. Do we have any other last minute questions? All right. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up for today. But again, I wanted to give a big thank you for everyone for joining us today for Virtual Art Club. We'll be back next month, August 11th at 1 p.m. And a huge thank you to Alexander for sharing your work and your story with us. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.